Hi, Mike Hixson here. Glad to be with you today. I have with me Justin and Mike Rogers, and both of these guys preach. Matter of fact, Mike is the dad. Justin is the son. Justin teaches at the Freed-Hardeman University, and we're grateful that these guys are with us today. And so glad to have both of you.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
We're going to talk today about the home, the Christian home, and really trying to pass the faith on to others. And to me, you guys have a unique story because, Mike, you did not initially set out to become a gospel preacher, but later in life you became a preacher. I know that there probably were any number of trials that you had to endure as a student, father, etc. And so maybe give us a little bit of a historical context, if you don't mind.
Well, the boys were, I think my youngest son, Mitchell, was about 5 years old when I first started preaching. I was an over-the-road truck driver. I owned my own truck, and I was gone a lot when the boys were young, and I just finally decided that if I was going to be a father that I needed to be, I needed to be at home.
Sure.
And so I started doing fill-in preaching. Owning my own truck, I could kind of choose my loads and not go on the weekend if I didn't want to go. And so I started doing some fill-in preaching on the weekends. And then just one quick story. One dispatch called me one Saturday and wanted me to go somewhere. And I said, I can't. I'm scheduled to preach tomorrow. And he said, you need to make up your mind whether you want to preach or drive a truck, because it's obvious you can't do both. And that helped me make my mind up. I parked my truck and started looking for a full-time preaching job, and that's...
So did you go to school full-time and preach at the same time?
I did. I was preaching in Paducah, Kentucky, and I talked to the brethren there, and they suggested that I go to Freed-Hardeman, and that's what I did. They let me come back every weekend, and we continued to have our house in Kentucky, and we would go home sometimes it would be we wouldn't get home before midnight on Saturday night because the boys were in sports, and and then I would teach a Bible class, preach Sunday morning, preach Sunday night, and then drive back to Henderson on Sunday night. We did that for 3 years.
Wow. And, that takes a lot of dedication, and I think about the support of your wife throughout that process. I mean, to be a mom, to be a wife, and really to allow you to do what you wanted to do, which was preach the gospel, which is a noble, I think, endeavor.
Well, I got to tell you, if it wasn't for my wife, we could not have done. The boys would not be what they are today without my wife in those formidable years.
So, Justin, are you the oldest or you're the oldest?
I'm the older, younger brother, yeah.
Okay, so I guess just being reared in a home where your dad makes a decision he wants to preach and he's going to school, I mean, did that change the dynamics of the house?
Well, yeah, I mean, for one, he decided to preach really before he had any formal education to preach, and so he did that, for about 2 or 3 years before we went to Henderson, and I was going into the 8th grade, and that's not the best time for a boy to move. It's when you're going into the 8th grade, I was starting to form my connections and my friendships, and we moved, and it was really hard at first, but it probably ended up being the best thing for me, actually, because I don't know that the friends that I had when we lived in Kentucky were the friends I ought to have had. And so we made it to Henderson, and I made new friends. Of course, the church is very strong in that area, probably because of Freed-Hardeman, but I had a lot of friends who were Christians, and really am friends with them to this day.
So I know your younger brother's a preacher as well, and I think a student at Freed-Hardeman in the graduate program,
right?
My understanding. So when did you decide, okay, this is what I want to do as well?
Well, I'm trying to think if I ever thought really about doing much of anything else. There was a time in high school where I thought that I would go work on watches because that's what my uncle had done, and it seemed like a good thing to do. But I don't know if I even seriously considered that by the time definitely I was a senior in high school, I knew I wanted to preach, and it was kind of an easy decision because we lived in Henderson. Freed Hardeman was right there, and so that's what I ended up doing, and kind of took that path from a very early age. I started preaching regularly as a freshman at Freed Hardeman, and really haven't stopped since. Yeah.
So when you were 18, 19 years of age, you began preaching and teaching, and I guess you're preaching on a regular basis. Were you in Henderson at that time?
I was in Henderson. We lived in Henderson until we moved to Covington, and
that was the spring of 2001.
Yeah, and we moved to Covington in the spring of 2001.
I think about when you're in the 8th grade and you have to move, and sometimes kids develop a rebellious streak, particularly when change occurs. And I think it's a testament to you, Mike, and to your wife, to the fact that you were able to keep things together, and then to rear 2 sons that are faithful members of the body of Christ, both preach. I mean, there are not many people can make a statement like that, you know what, when it's all said and done, things turned out to be really, really good for everyone involved.
Mm-hmm. And they both love what they do and can't think of doing anything else. And that really, we went through some challenging years. I mean, we had our challenges as parents, and but
I think about somebody who decided to preach later in life, and you're doing secular work, and then you're trying to do spiritual work. To me, secular work, and I appreciate all the opportunities that are out there for people to work secularly. I've done secular work, but if you want to preach, really, secular work is just a job. It's just a means to an end. But when it comes to preaching, that's a love. I mean, there's a love there, and I always tell people, look, if you love what you do, it's not work. Mm-hmm. And so I love what I do. And so to me, it's a great blessing. I get up every day and I'm excited. And I think about, as a preacher, you preach regularly, you teach. There has to be a sense of passion in doing that. Don't you think?
Oh yeah. I mean, well, one of the things that a lot of people will talk about is burnout, experiencing burnout. And I definitely can understand how people could get burned out. But I think if you're doing something you love and you're serving people and you can genuinely see that the fruits of your labor are evident around you, exactly, then it's harder to get burned out when you're doing that. Burnout tends to be when I'm focusing too much on myself and what I'm doing. Sure. When I'm trying to pour into other people, it seems to be more of a rewarding experience.
So, as a preacher, as a father, and of course you've got children now, and I remember years ago, and I don't remember the exact setting, but I remember much younger in life, and our son was young, and my wife making a statement. I never really thought about it, but she said something about, everybody seemed to get a piece of me before family got a piece of me.
Right.
And I never really thought about how much time maybe I spent away from my family. And I know that, sometimes the wife, the children can resent that. And I've seen instances where that's happened. But my wife never, she never resented it. But, as a dad, as a husband, I can see where your family could resent all the people pulling at you and the time away. And I know there are a lot of demands on your time as a preacher, as a teacher. You get called to go do meetings and lectureships and things, and those are important. But at the end of the day, you still have a family, you still have obligations, and so how do you balance all of that?
I remember, and he doesn't remember this. He says he doesn't remember this, but after I quit driving the truck and started preaching full time, one Saturday morning, I got up and I got my dress like I was going to the office, and he asked, where are you going? And I said, I got to go to the hospital. And he said, I've got a ball game this morning. I said, I know. I'll be home for your ball game. And he said, I wish you'd go back to driving the truck. I saw you more then than I do now. and that cut like a knife.
Does.
And I made a decision then that I was going to spend more time at home with the family, and I would shoot ball with him out in the yard, and we would just I tried to be there more for the boys after that. Then it wasn't a priority. I mean, I had been gone for just about all of the boys' lives up until that point. I had been gone during the week, and I realized the importance of being home.
Yeah, I would say, obviously, it's something you have to be intentional about, because it's very easy to allow other people's expectations to set your agenda. And you have to draw very firm boundaries and be okay with letting some people down. A lot of churches function through the preacher. That may not be the best model, but it's the way that a lot of churches work. And so every event that's at the church, the preacher's supposed to be there. When somebody's sick, the preacher's supposed to have seen them and report on them. And I'm fortunate where I work in ministry now, we have an eldership that really understands there are limitations on what they can really ask me to do, and they've taken a step forward. So our elders go to the hospital and see people. Our elders make visits, personal visits. Our elders conduct Bible studies. Our elders are at the events. And if I show up, that's great. If I don't, that's okay too. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that, because it allows me a little bit of leeway to use my time in a way that maximizes my family.
Really, I think that fits more the biblical model of the church. And in many instances, you have this pastoral system that, has become popular in a lot of different places, and not necessarily, it shouldn't necessarily be that way, but that's the way it is in a lot of places. And so I'm very fortunate where I preach. The elders allow me the opportunity to preach, to teach, to go different places and do things. And really the only expectation, the only thing that they really ask of me is to preach, to study, and do radio, TV work. And so I'm grateful for that. They take care of hospitals, but that's rare. I understand that. That is a rare situation, because most preachers in local work, they wear a lot of different hats. I don't do that. And so I'm grateful for that opportunity that I have. But at the same time, I know there are a lot of guys that, they're wearing a lot of hats and they're running, from can to can every day.
Well, and some guys want it that way. They like to be right in the middle of everything and know what's going on. And I think part of it is too, you have to be okay with the church running without you. That you are a member of the church who serves in a very unique role, but at the same time, your primary responsibility is to use your opportunity as a father and a husband to build your family's spiritual health.
Yeah, and I think about as a parent, as a father, you were talking a moment ago when, it kind of hit home with you that you'd been gone a lot, your time. I remember years ago when I just started preaching full time, and we were thinking about moving to Memphis, and our family lived in Middle Tennessee, and a buddy of mine that had been a mentor to me and a very strong leader and influencer in my life, he said, it's hard to put a price on being close to family and close proximity. And at the time I was young, ambitious, idealistic. And, to me, it's like, look, I just want to preach, and I just want to go wherever I can go to preach the gospel. And I look back now and I'm grateful for all the opportunities that I've had. And we've been away from Middle Tennessee for a long, long time. And, to some extent I look back and I think, and I'm not saying this begrudgingly, but we've made a lot of sacrifices in terms of time spent with family, parents, grandparents. We lost a lot of time that can never be recovered. And I don't say that, I don't say that negatively. It's just a fact. It was a choice we made. I think we made the right choice, but I think you have to understand the expectations of a preacher. A lot of people that work secularly, weekend rolls around, they can, if they're families live out of town, they can go visit. Well, if you're preaching, you can't do things.
Amen.
So, it's just a different type. And so there's give and take. I think the rewards are greater in so many ways. The fact that, when you decided to preach, you did that because you wanted to help people. You wanted to impact the world for good. And aren't you grateful for the decision you made?
Yeah, for sure. I think his father also, we haven't mentioned this, but he also was a preacher.
Really?
So
we got 3 generations now.
Yeah. So he kind of understood what he was getting into, even though he came into it a little bit later. And I had the experience of both my grandfather and my father, because we spent a lot of time with my grandparents his parents when we were growing up. They lived pretty close. In my early years, we went to the same congregation. And so I got to follow them around. And I'm sure that had a real influence on me in ways that I don't even think about. But
yeah, I'm sure. So from the vantage point of marriage, when we talk about marriage and preaching can be tough. And, sometimes you're shouldering a heavy load. And I know that probably from a congregational perspective, the church thinks that the preacher's wife knows everything.
Yes.
But, there are a lot of things I never tell my wife. I don't want her to know certain things. And, to younger preachers that may be watching this particular program today, how do you encourage them to navigate through some of the difficulties, particularly in marriage? Because when churches have problems, that weighs heavily on the preacher. The eldership can have a tremendous impact on your relationship as a married couple.
Yeah. I don't know what in the world I would do without my wife. I've been told that my wife is a better preacher's wife than I am a preacher. And it's just so important to have that support. And you're talking about raising kids. You can't do it without a godly woman. I have 2 images that are burned into my mind. The first one is when he was about 3 years old. He was about 2 years old, a little over 2 years old. And the image is my wife is very pregnant and with our second child, and Justin is sitting on her lap and she's reading a Bible story to both of them. It begins in the womb. Raising faithful boys begins in the womb. And that image I have in my mind. But the second image I have in my mind is when Justin is about 4 or 5 and Mitchell is 1 or 2. And they're both sitting on her lap and she's reading a Bible story book to them. And then when the grandkids, when they were very small, they would come and stay with us. They would not go to bed without a Bible story being read. And that's because their mom and daddy read a Bible story to them before they went to bed.
So let me ask, I think that's a great segue maybe to this question, but we talk about passing the faith on. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, Paul talks about the genuine faith that dwelt in Timothy and then in his grandmother and mother. And then he said, and I am persuaded in you also. So how is it that we can develop or help to develop our children's faith? And then the goal, the prayer is that faith will become their own faith.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great question. And I think there are a lot of Christian parents who have agonized over that, right? I mean, the train up a child in the way you should go verse that really haunts a lot of Christian parents. I'm not sure there's a magical formula. I think what you do is you provide them opportunities. You help them to find value and worth in the church. You talk positively about the church and its leaders and those who serve. And I think you try to create an image in their minds of this is what a good life, this is what a successful life looks like. It involves the church. And they're going to make their own decisions, but you create the atmosphere.
Yeah, you triggered a thought in my mind. Peter talks about he that would love life and see good days. And to me, I always say, the best life is the Christian life because it's the blessed life.
Yeah.
And, it's really, we talk about trying to, in some ways, insulate our children from the world. And there are so many things that are pulling for our attention and whatnot. But if somehow we can share with them that, look, a life of faith is the absolute best life possible. It's not to say that you're going to be freed from the problems and trials of life, because in many cases, sometimes you face more trouble and trial. Yeah. But to know that you've got something that has some substance or bite to it.
Mm-hmm. We have relied heavily on Deuteronomy 6 in our home. And when Moses is said, this is what God has told me to tell you, to love God
with all of your heart, soul, and mind.
And you've got to, that's first. You've got to love God yourself as parents. It can't be pretend. It's got to be genuine. I have a book in my library, How to Be a Hero to Your Kids. And one of the chapters is, you can fool a fool, you can con a con, but you can't kid a kid. And the reason is because kids will see through it. They will know if you're trying to snow them. And so you got to love God, and you've got to show them that you love God. You got to teach them to love God. Teaching is verbal. You got to be sharing that with them, and then you've got to do it when you're walking about and when you're talking, and when you got to have it on the frontals of your head. You've got to have it written on the doorpost of your house. That people have to know that you love God and that God lives in your home.
Yeah, I think about, James talks about pure religion, and I think about the term that comes to mind is authentic. Our children can tell the difference between that which is fake and that which is real. And for our faith to be authentic, to live it out, there are really two ways that we can preach, either visibly or verbally. And that I've always heard the verbal sermon in many ways impacts people more than the visible does. But, I think that our children are watching us, and they mimic our character, our behavior. And sometimes we may not even know that they're observing and listening. But, Jesus, don't you think it's interesting that in Matthew chapter 23, when Jesus delivered that series of woes directed to the quote-unquote religious leaders of that day, he said, they say and do not.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I've noticed about people, when you ask them about their children, oh, let me tell you what they're doing, and they describe their career. And I've often thought about, what if we could flip that narrative as Christians and say, let me tell you how they're serving the church. And that's what we start with, not, hey, they've gone to graduate school, or they've got this job, or, oh, they've got this humongous house. No, how about we talk about success in terms of spiritual things rather than secular things? And it would really help people to prioritize that in their homes.
Don't you think it goes back maybe to, Colossians chapter 3, when Paul said, set your affections on things above and not on things which are right.
Yeah. One of the things that we did, even before I started preaching, I was still driving a truck. If I was gone and their mom was sick, the boys went to church. We called a neighbor to come and pick them up. They didn't miss because Mama couldn't go and Daddy wasn't home. We called a neighbor.
You know what that says to me? It says to me that Matthew 6:33 was very real to you.
Exactly.
Seeking first the kingdom of God. There's this battle today, and I think many Christian parents are on the front line of battle when it comes to the secular versus the spiritual. And, there's so many things that are vying for our attention. And I think about children today, there are so many different activities for them to be involved in. And if you're not careful, the spiritual can become a casualty.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, you have to think about as a parent, because there are opportunities to be involved in many things. What am I training my child to become? Am I training them to become a professional softball player or a baseball player? Am I training them to become a basketball player? Or a Christian. And that helps you make those decisions, and I think in a much easier way. If you think about where you're trying to get with your children, then you do prioritize. I remember it was tennis tryouts. You remember when you guys pulled up to the tennis courts and pulled me off of tennis tryouts? You believe this? And because we had a gospel meeting. This wasn't a Sunday or a Wednesday. This was through the week. And it was like, well, you may not make the tennis team, but you are going to go to the gospel meeting. And of course, I never would have become a professional tennis player. So in the long run, what's the big deal?
But at that point in time in your life, that was important.
I was upset at the time, but
at the same time, as a parent, in your mind, okay, this is just what we do. This is who we are.
We never allowed baseball, basketball, football to come before. We allowed them to play. We allowed both the boys to play sports, but not that they always understood that whether it was a regular service or whether it was even just a fellowship at the church, that came before.
I know of a brother today whose son was a highly recruited football player and made the decision to sign with Texas A&M. I think he initially signed with Oklahoma and then transferred to Texas A&M. But they had a discussion on the front end with the agreement that on Wednesday nights he would be at Bible study. That when the time came around for him to leave, that he would be allowed to leave and go to Bible study rather than practice. And I thought, that says something that to us, faith is important.
Yeah, that's a great story, because I think a lot of times the expectation is, well, the coach will think you're letting the team down if you don't come to this. But what I've seen in my experience, the Christians who have said, no, this is going to come first, the coach and the team actually gains respect for that person because they stand for something. They're a person of integrity, and they're not going to miss any other time. It's just for those kinds of, spiritual things.
So it really comes back to prioritizing, what is important. And as a parent, that's a tough thing. That's a tough call sometimes, but to be the parent and to make those decisions, which, I know looking back, you have no regrets in that regard.
One of the things that training up a child in the way it should go, that word train, it carries with it the idea that you have a goal. How many times have the boys heard their mother say, all I care about is you being in heaven?
And you know what? I think that's a good close for us, because I know our time's gone. But when it's all said and done, at the end of the day, to me, the most important thing is for our children to be in heaven. I remember a fellow asked on one occasion, he said, where will your children be in eternity? And then he responded by saying, in all probability, where you are. And that, I think that says a lot. I mean, because, they can become great in the eyes of the world, but the key is we want them to be in heaven one day.
Absolutely.
Mike and Justin, thank you guys for being with me today. Appreciate you, appreciate your great work, and our prayer is God will bless you with many more years of service.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you for being a part of our program today. Hope to see you back here next week. Until then, God bless.